Some lights don't flicker, they dim quietly, waiting to be seen again. Harrison Ford hadn't stepped onto a talk show stage in years. But when he sat across from Steve Harvey under those studio lights, it wasn't a conversation he came for, it was something else. A return, a reckoning, and a truth that had been burning in silence for far too long. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. When Harrison Ford walks onto the set of the Steve Harvey Show, the energy is easy, electric, familiar. The crowd rises with applause, cameras pan, the stage lights shimmer just right. It feels like the beginning of a feel-good Hollywood segment, the kind where legends swap old set stories and the host delivers punchlines that land like clockwork. Steve stands center stage with his signature grin, one hand holding cue cards, the other already gesturing toward the man walking in like he never needed an entrance. Harrison isn't dressed for drama. Simple dark blazer, black shirt, jeans, no tie, no flash, just presence. The crowd loves him, they always have. But tonight, there's something beneath that love, an undercurrent they don't quite notice yet, not until later. Steve welcomes him like an old friend. Ladies and gentlemen, Indiana Jones himself, you better buckle up, cause the man really flies. Laughter, big, honest, ripple through the room laughter. Steve continues, walking toward his seat, nudging Harrison with his elbow. Now I heard a rumor, he says, grinning wide. They say you once flew a helicopter just to get some pizza. Tell me that's true. The crowd erupts. Harrison smiles, that iconic half-smirk that says both I'm here and I'd rather be somewhere quiet. He chuckles once, not the kind of laugh that rides the wave of a punchline, but something smaller, more distant. He glances toward the audience, then shifts in his chair. Steve leans in, waiting for a comeback, but Harrison just says, calmly, like he's answering a different question, I used to think I'd never fly again. Silence. Not heavy yet, just a pause, enough to make someone blink, to tilt a head. Steve blinks. What, like never again? His tone tries to stay playful, but it dips. Ford nods once, eyes fixed on a spot past the lights. Yeah. Never again. The room doesn't laugh this time, not because it's awkward, because something just changed. It's subtle but unmistakable, a shift in gravity, like the moment a campfire crackles a bit too loud and everyone stops talking at once. The studio lights don't dim, but they feel dimmer. The applause signs aren't lit, but no one would have clapped anyway. Steve adjusts in his seat. His smile softens. He knows something's coming, he just doesn't know what yet. Harrison exhales, slow and quiet. People think flying is about control, he says, voice low. But sometimes you land because you have nowhere else to go. That wasn't on the cue cards. That wasn't in the plan. Steve doesn't push. He doesn't joke. Instead, he just looks at Harrison and says gently, then maybe tonight we go off script. And somewhere in the crowd, a woman who came for laughs reaches for a tissue and doesn't know why. Not yet, but she will. Steve leans back, crossing one leg slowly, watching Harrison with new eyes. The audience has gone still, not stiff, but softer. Something sacred has begun to unfold, and even the cameras seem to move more gently now, as if not to disturb it. Steve clears his throat, trying to bridge the silence with something lighter. You know, he says, voice calm, a lot of folks don't know this, but you once flew a helicopter out to rescue a little girl who got lost in the mountains. That wasn't a movie, that was real. Harrison shifts in his seat. There's no pride in the movement, no performance, just a pause. His eyes drift down to his hands, resting quietly in his lap. He looks at them like they've held too much. I didn't go out there to be a hero, he says softly. I went out there because I was looking for someone who reminded me of someone I used to be. Steve doesn't smile this time, he just listens. I didn't even know her name until later, Harrison continues. Didn't matter. I saw that map, that ridge line, the weather moving in, and something in me just said go, so I went. Steve tilts his head. And when you found her? Harrison looks up slowly. She was crying, but not calling for help, just sitting there, like she thought no one was coming. His voice doesn't shake, but it's fragile. Steve leans in, elbows on knees. That sounds familiar. Harrison breathes out through his nose. A faint smile, but not one born from joy, more like memory. I didn't tell anyone this, he says, eyes now fixed on Steve, but when I looked at her, I didn't see a rescue, I saw myself. Years ago, same silence, same look, lost but not screaming. There's a weight in the room now, not heavy, but grounding. The kind that makes people shift in their seats, not from discomfort, but because they suddenly remember something they thought they had forgotten. Steve speaks quieter now. Where were you when you felt that way? Harrison doesn't answer right away. Instead, he studies the stage, the floor beneath them, as if the answer might be written there. I was everywhere, he finally says. Movie sets, hotel rooms, red carpets, airplanes, I was everywhere, except where I actually was. Steve's eyebrows furrow slightly. He knows that feeling, the applause without presence, the spotlight without warmth. I was flying high, Harrison says, but inside I was grounded, not in the good way, just still, trapped in motion. The crowd doesn't make a sound. You can almost hear the breath of the man in the third row as he leans forward. I used to think flying was about freedom, Harrison continues, about rising above. But some flights, Steve, some flights aren't about escaping, they're about returning. Steve's voice drops. Returning to what? Harrison looks at him. Not through him, not past him, at him, to where I lost myself. A long pause follows, not uncomfortable, just necessary. And did you? Steve asks. Did you find yourself again? Harrison shrugs, then nods. Pieces. Some days I pick up one, other days I lose two. But that flight, that girl, it reminded me that even when you feel gone, someone might still be searching. Steve exhales through his nose, eyes soft. Sounds like she wasn't the only one rescued that day. Harrison smiles, barely, maybe. And in that moment, the crowd isn't an audience anymore. They're witnesses. Witnesses to a man who's worn many names, pilot, carpenter, movie star, but tonight he wears something else. Human, just human. The studio stays quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't beg to be filled. Just breath, just light, just two men sitting in a moment that feels like it stopped time. Steve doesn't speak. He doesn't have to. He knows that when someone begins to unfold something long kept folded, you let them. Harrison shifts slightly in his chair, the kind of movement that feels less like repositioning and more like stepping into something heavy. The shadows on his face deepen as the lights fall softer now, casting a halo of calm that holds the air still. There was a season, he says slowly, after the divorce, when I left the city, the press, the noise. I bought some land in Wyoming. Big skies, quiet nights, no one knocking, just me, a workbench, and a woodshop that didn't ask questions. Steve listens, elbows still resting on his knees, hands folded, gaze steady. Harrison continues, I'd get up before the sun, drink black coffee, go into that shop. I'd work on chairs, tables, just wood and time, the kind of silence that creaks before it settles. He pauses, like the next sentence doesn't come easily. I used to think that if I just kept moving my hands, maybe my heart would remember how to move too. His voice doesn't break, but it bends. There's a rhythm to sawing wood. Back and forth, steady, almost like a heartbeat, except mine wasn't beating, not really, it was just echoing. Steve's face softens. He recognizes the sound of a man who's been surrounded by people, yet lived completely alone. Some nights, Harrison says, I'd just sit in the corner of that shop, light off, music off, just me and the smell of cedar, old memories, and the kind of emptiness that hums. He leans forward, resting his forearms on his thighs. His fingers curl slightly, as if still holding the handle of a saw. There was one night, he says, quieter now, when I walked out back, looked up at the sky, no moon, just stars. I thought maybe I'd take the plane out, just fly. No destination, no flight plan, just up. Steve doesn't blink. I didn't want to die, Harrison says, but I didn't exactly want to stay. That lands, not just with Steve, with everyone. The crowd is breathless now, some lean forward. Others look down at their laps, as if that kind of honesty demands privacy. I got in the cockpit, he says, sat there, engine off, hands on the yoke, feet still, and I just stared ahead like maybe the darkness would tell me what to do. Steve finally speaks. What stopped you? Harrison looks at him, really looks. I don't know, maybe nothing, maybe everything. He lets the silence hold that answer. I didn't turn on the engine, he says. I just sat for hours. Cold creeping in, nothing but the sound of wind against metal. And I remember thinking, if no one finds me here, would anyone know I was even gone? Steve swallows, barely. His hand moves gently toward his chest, fingers resting on the small gold crucifix hanging there. And that's when I did something I hadn't done in weeks, Harrison says. I picked up my phone. He gives a small, ironic smile. I wasn't calling anyone, I wasn't texting, I just opened YouTube, let the algorithm decide, anything to not feel like I was thinking. He laughs once, soft and hollow. I watched a video about building a canoe. Then a video about the Grand Canyon. Then something else came on. He stops. Steve straightens slightly, as if his body already knows what his mind hasn't caught up to. I didn't search for it, Harrison says. It just showed up. Steve's hand tightens slightly over the cross. I clicked it without thinking, Harrison continues. And there you were, standing on a stage, talking about pain, about God, about how some people don't want to end their life. They just want the hurt to stop. The room doesn't breathe. Harrison looks down, then back up. I didn't know I needed it, but I did. And just like that, the weight shifts again. The man the world saw as invincible just admitted he was once too tired to move. And the man sitting across from him, wearing a suit and holding cue cards, may have unknowingly saved him with words spoken into a camera years ago. But that's not the twist. That's just the beginning. The room didn't shift. It settled, like dust finding stillness in a beam of light. The crowd, the crew, even the cameras, they all seemed to realize they weren't just watching an interview anymore. Something more was happening, something that didn't come with applause signs or commercial breaks. Steve sat forward, eyes locked on Harrison, not with the curiosity of a host, but with the quiet ache of someone who sensed the next words might reach into a place he hadn't opened in years. Harrison leaned back in his chair, not to distance himself, but to let something rise. He looked straight ahead, not at Steve, not at the audience, but at something farther, something only he could see. It wasn't just a video, he said. It was you. Steve didn't speak. He only listened, but his hand moved slowly, almost subconsciously, to the cross resting on his chest. Harrison's voice was low, steady, not rehearsed, but remembered. You were on stage, talking about storms, about how sometimes the thing that's breaking you is actually breaking you open. And then you said something I hadn't heard before, not like that, not with that kind of weight. He paused, eyes flicking to Steve, then down again. You said, God doesn't waste pain. The words dropped like stones into a still lake. Ripples moved across the faces in the audience. One woman wiped her cheek. A man in the third row pressed his lips together, holding something back. I'd heard people talk about faith before, Harrison continued. Heard actors quote scripture, politicians recite blessings, but it always felt clean, polished. Like they were reading lines, but you. He looked up. You said it like you had bled it. Steve blinked just once, but his fingers now gripped the crucifix tighter. I don't know how long I sat there, Harrison said. I just remember your voice filling that cold cockpit, talking about how if you're still breathing, it means God's not finished with you yet. Steve exhaled through his nose, slow and trembling. I watched it again, Harrison said. Then again, I don't know what I was waiting for. Maybe to see if you'd flinch, if you were acting, but you weren't, you were just being. He smiled faintly, not from joy, but from recognition. And that's what broke me open. Steve finally spoke, but his voice cracked before it reached the first word. He tried again, quieter. I was just talking, he said. Harrison leaned forward. No, he said gently, you were testifying. Another pause. This one didn't feel like television, it felt like church. Steve's eyes began to shine, not from the stage lights, but from something deeper, something rising. I never told anyone this, Harrison continued, but that night I stood up. Not because I suddenly felt better, not because I was healed, but because I wasn't invisible anymore. Steve's lips parted, but no words came, only breath. You didn't know me, Harrison said. But somehow, through that screen, through your words, I felt seen, and that was enough. That was everything. The crowd didn't move. No one fidgeted. No one whispered. Every person in that room had been broken at some point. And now they were hearing that even the strongest among us sometimes sit in cockpits at midnight, asking God if they still matter. Steve looked down, both hands now holding the cross like it might float away if he let go. Harrison spoke softer now. You once said the pain we carry is sometimes the doorway to our calling, that if God trusted you with wounds, maybe it's because he knew they could become windows. Steve looked up, eyes full, voice gone. That night, Harrison said, I didn't fly, I didn't run. I just sat there with your words ringing in that silence, and somehow, that silence didn't scare me anymore. He looked towards Steve, not as a guest looking at a host, but as a man looking at another man who had unknowingly stood between him and the dark. And all this time, he said, I carried that with me, your words, that clip, that crucifix. Steve swallowed hard. I came here tonight, Harrison said, not to promote a movie, not to tell stories. I came to give something back. The lights above them didn't change, but somehow the stage felt brighter, as if truth had a glow of its own. Steve leaned forward now, voice shaky. What do you mean, give something back? Harrison smiled gently. You didn't know you were lifting someone. That's what made it real. That's what made it sacred. And then, like it had been waiting for the right moment, the twist unfolded, quietly, humbly, and with the power to rearrange the air in the room. You saved me, Harrison said. The words didn't shout. They didn't need to. They landed. And they stayed. Harrison sat upright now, not stiff, not posed, just steady. The light above caught the line of his jaw, the quiet crease near his brow, the years folded gently into his face. Across from him, Steve sat bowed forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped like in prayer, though no one had said anything holy yet. The silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent, like even the air knew it had to listen. Harrison looked at Steve, really looked, and his voice came low and even. You once said, he began, that sometimes your pain is your ministry, that the things that broke you gave you a language no perfect person could speak. Steve looked up, his eyes wet but open. You said, Harrison continued, that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. He paused, letting the words echo, not in volume, but in meaning. I watched that clip 3 times that night, he said. Not because it fixed me, not because I was searching for religion. I wasn't. I didn't grow up with church. I didn't know how to pray, but I knew what it felt like to be in a storm. Steve nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. And your words, Harrison said, they were a lighthouse. He shifted in his seat, placed both feet firmly on the floor, hands resting loosely on his legs. I wasn't looking for a sermon, he said. I wasn't looking for God. I was looking for something that didn't lie to me. He leaned forward slightly, and you didn't lie. Steve tried to speak, but what came out was barely a whisper. I was just trying to make it, he said. I wasn't trying to save anybody. Harrison smiled, soft and sure. And that's exactly why you did. Steve covered his mouth with one hand, his eyes now shining too much to hold back. I didn't even know it was still online, he said. That video, it was from a rough night. I didn't have a script, I just talked. And because you weren't trying to be perfect, Harrison said, you were able to be true. The studio felt different now. Not like a place for entertainment, but like a place where something sacred had just exchanged hands. Not applause, not attention, something quieter, something deeper. I don't believe in performance, Harrison said. I believe in presence. And that night you showed up, not with polish, with pain. Steve leaned back, shaking his head lightly. You don't know how many times I've asked myself if it's enough, he said. All the jokes, all the stories. All the nights I felt like maybe I'm just talking to myself. Harrison nodded, his voice almost a murmur now. Well, one night you weren't. Steve swallowed hard. I took those words, Harrison said, and I wrote them on a piece of scrap wood, nailed it above the window in my workshop, right where the sun hits in the morning. Steve looked up, stunned. You did that? I did, Harrison said. Because some mornings, that light hit those words before it ever hit me, and I needed that. Steve closed his eyes, just for a second, like he was trying to hold the moment in his chest. You said God doesn't waste pain, Harrison repeated. You said if you're still breathing, it means you're still chosen. You said storms don't come to destroy, they come to uncover. Steve's hand moved to his chest again, fingers resting on the cross. And now I'm here, Harrison said, not because I have something to promote, not because I'm strong, but because I needed you to know you reached someone. Steve wiped his face, no shame in the tears now, just release. You think you're just trying to survive, Harrison said, but what you don't see is the people watching you survive and drawing breath because of it. He paused, letting the words settle. I didn't come here to tell a story, he said. I came to return something, something that doesn't belong to me. Steve looked up, eyes red, voice thin. What's that? Harrison leaned in, elbows on his knees. Hope, he said. You gave it to me when I didn't know I needed it, and I think maybe you forgot what it sounds like when it comes back. The audience didn't clap, they didn't move. They just sat there, absorbing the truth like sunlight through a window they didn't know was open. And in that space, where vulnerability met reverence, the flame Steve had passed out into the world without knowing had returned to him. Still lit, still alive, still burning. Steve sat still, his fingers closed tight around the cross resting on his chest. He wasn't performing anymore. He wasn't hosting. He wasn't commanding the stage with timing and charm. He was just a man sitting across from another man who had seen something in him he hadn't dared to see in himself. Harrison didn't rush. He let the silence breathe, let it hold the room, and when he spoke, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, the truth never does. You're not just a comedian, Steve, he said gently, you're something else. Steve didn't look up. His shoulders moved slightly, the way they do when someone is trying not to cry, or maybe realizing they already are. You think you're just telling jokes, Harrison said, just getting through the day, but what you're doing, it's more than that. He leaned forward, his voice even calm, grounded. You're a minister. Steve let out a breath, half laugh, half disbelief. His head dropped lower, hands still holding the cross, like it was anchoring him in the moment. I wear boots and a suit, he murmured, barely audible. I tell jokes, I cuss sometimes, I'm just trying to survive, man. And that, Harrison said, is exactly why it's real. The crowd remained frozen. No one moved. No one dared to interrupt what felt like revelation. You said something once, Harrison continued, and I never forgot it. You said God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. Steve looked up slowly, his eyes wet but steady now. He nodded, like he was hearing his own words for the first time. You didn't know who was listening when you said it, Harrison said, but I was, sitting in a workshop, covered in sawdust and silence, holding on by threads I couldn't even see. He smiled, not with his mouth, but with something older, something worn and full. You were preaching, Steve, you just didn't know the pulpit was a screen. Steve leaned back slightly, one hand now covering his face. His voice cracked. I never thought I was worthy of that, I'm not. I'm not clean enough, not consistent, not holy. Harrison's voice softened, like he was talking to something inside Steve, not just the man in front of him. That's the lie, he said, that you have to be clean to be called, that you have to have it all together to be used. He paused, then added quietly, sometimes the broken carry more light than the whole. Steve sat with that, not defending, not deflecting, just receiving. You think God only speaks through robes and titles, Harrison said, but maybe he speaks through people who have bled, who have fallen, who have cried in the dark and still woke up. Steve's lips trembled, his voice barely held together. I never asked for that. Harrison nodded, neither did I. The crowd exhaled, like they'd been holding something for 5 minutes without knowing it. I don't know what I am, Steve said. I just talk, I try to help. But I mess up too. And still, Harrison said, people find hope in your words. He looked toward the audience now, then back at Steve. You reach people who would never step into a church. People who think faith is a building or a rulebook, but then they hear you and they realize maybe grace sounds like laughter sometimes. Steve blinked slowly, as if trying to hold onto the moment before it slipped through. I didn't grow up with all the answers, Harrison said, but I know what it feels like when truth lands, and Steve, you carry it, whether you know it or not. The room didn't feel like a studio anymore. It felt like something older. A quiet sanctuary made not of walls but of honesty. "You're a minister in disguise," Harrison said, "and the disguise is working." Steve chuckled softly, wiping at his face. "I never saw it that way." "You don't have to," Harrison said. "I saw it for you." And for the first time in the entire interview, Steve Harvey didn't respond. He just sat there, cross in his hand, tears in his eyes, and the weight of a truth too big to argue with resting gently on his shoulders. The lights had softened now, not dark but tender, as if the stage itself knew this moment needed no spotlight. The audience wasn't watching anymore. They were witnessing. No applause, no shifting in seats, just breath, just stillness. Just two men sitting face to face with something larger than either of them lingering between the words. Steve looked down, then back up. His voice was quieter than ever. "Why me?" he asked, barely above a whisper. "Out of everybody God could have used, why me?" The question didn't fall like a line in a script. It landed like something sacred, something asked in silence 1,000 times before, but never out loud. And now it hung in the air like the smoke of a slow-burning candle. Harrison didn't answer right away. He just looked at Steve, not with sympathy, not even with reassurance, with understanding. Then he leaned in, elbows on his knees, voice like stone wrapped in velvet. "Because you've been broken." Steve blinked, and only the broken know how to speak to what hurts. His words didn't echo, they didn't need to. They settled straight into the marrow. "You carry wounds," Harrison said, "not as shame, but as language, and that language, it reaches people who don't even know they need to hear it." Steve pressed a hand to his chest again, not for show, just to feel something anchor him. "You think light only belongs to the perfect," Harrison continued, "but sometimes it's the cracked lantern that shows the way." Steve wiped his eyes slowly, like the tears weren't a weakness, but a release. "I've failed," he said. "I've made mistakes. I've said things I wish I could take back." "And yet," Harrison replied, "you're still here, still breathing, still shining." He leaned back just slightly. "You are a light, Steve, and lights, they don't need to know who's watching. They just need to keep burning." The words held him there, not in a place of performance, but in a place of purpose. "You told the world once," Harrison said softly, "that God uses the broken." He paused. "Now let me say it to you." Steve closed his eyes, the weight of it all sinking in like a tide finally touching shore. "God chose you," Harrison said, "not despite your pain, because of it." Silence swept through the room again. A deeper kind, the kind that doesn't call for response, only presence. "You think you've just been surviving," Harrison whispered, "but what you've been doing is holding the torch for people who forgot what light looks like." Steve let out a sound, part breath, part cry, and it wasn't shame, it was freedom. Harrison nodded once, slow and certain. "You are not here by accident," he said. "You've been carrying hope in plain sight, and tonight, I just wanted to hold it up so you could see it too." No one clapped, no one needed to, because in that stillness, in that quiet space where truth doesn't demand to be loud, something holy happened. And the man who had made millions laugh finally sat in the truth that had followed him for years. He was never just surviving, he was chosen to be a light, and tonight he finally saw it. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.